Why have more people left Mormonism over this issue than almost any other? The Book of Abraham. What is this tiny, unassuming 5-chapter book that definitively proves that Joseph Smith was a fraud and a false prophet? Of all the different books in Mormon scriptures, it is the only one that we have an original manuscript for, and yet the LDS Church was reluctant to publish a translation of it. The Book of Abraham debacle has revealed a deadly rot at the very heart of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It has produced a framework and a perspective that is, quite honestly, dangerous. In this video, as a born-again Christian, I want to urge my Latter-day Saint friends to rethink their perspectives on this issue and consider that perhaps the Book of Abraham is not scripture, but rather a gift from God given to us so that we may know definitively that Joseph Smith is a false prophet. Okay, so what is the Book of Abraham? It's summertime in 1835. The Latter-day Saints are currently headquartered in Kirtland, Ohio. Just 5 years earlier, their prophet Joseph Smith had translated and published the Book of Mormon, and the Latter-day Saints are hard at work constructing the first of their modern temples, now known as the Kirtland Temple. On July 3rd, a traveling businessman named Michael Chandler arrived in Kirtland with 4 human figures, together with some 2 or more rolls of papyrus covered with hieroglyphic figures and devices. Now, the founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith, had been well established in the eyes of the people as one who could translate ancient languages by the power of God. In Mosiah, one of the books in the Book of Mormon, it says that seers are those who are called by God to provide translations of ancient works. Since Joseph was heralded as a seer by the Latter-day Saints, it seemed reasonable to them that Joseph might be able to look at these papyrus rolls and actually yield some sort of translation of them. Now you have to understand the context of this. I mean, Egyptian is still relatively unknown at this time. The Rosetta Stone, which provided the basis of our modern understanding of Egyptian hieroglyphics, had only been found in 1799, a few decades earlier, and the only scholars who really had studied this were overseas. There doesn't seem to be anyone that we know of in the US at that time who had really any knowledge of Egyptian hieroglyphics, which means that no one could check Joseph's translation of the papyri. After examining the papyri, Smith claimed that one of the rolls contained the writings of Abraham, another the writings of Joseph of Egypt. Oliver Cowdery later said, Enoch's pillar, as mentioned by Josephus, is upon the same roll. It's important to state just how remarkable this claim is. Our oldest manuscripts of the Old Testament are from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are between the 1st and 3rd centuries BC. And this claims to be almost 2,000 years earlier. I mean, that would make these bits of papyri the oldest biblical manuscripts that we have. Now, what's more is that Joseph claimed that this was an autograph, the original document that Abraham himself wrote. We don't even have any of the autographs for any parts of the Bible that we know of. And in fact, even the gold plates that Joseph supposedly translated to bring forth the Book of Mormon, those gold plates had been taken back into heaven by this point. And just consider what a staggeringly remarkable happenstance this would be, that a random traveling businessman would happen to have in his possession a 4,000-year-old autograph written by the great patriarch himself. I mean, either this truly is a great work of God in bringing forth Scripture in this latter day, or it was a fraud from the very beginning. The Latter-day Saints believed Joseph's claim, and so they scrounged together the cash to purchase Chandler's entire exhibit for $2,400. And if you do the math, that amounts to around $88,300 in today's cash. Joseph started working on the translation of these documents, and though he didn't complete their total translation by the time he died in 1844, in Times and Seasons, which is a Nauvoo publication, the first version of the Book of Abraham was released in 1842. 40 years after that, in 1880, it was officially canonized to be a part of the Pearl of Great Price, a part of Latter-day Saint scriptures. Let's just pause and take a look at what the Book of Abraham actually teaches. It's not that long. If you're curious, go read it yourself. As a Christian, I think that some of the most objectionable and problematic parts of Mormonism contained in their standard works can be found in the Book of Abraham. Just to give a quick sampling of some of these things, Abraham teaches that God dwells near a star named Kolob, and God reveals that all spirits are eternal. They existed before, they shall have no end, for they are nolam, or eternal. It also teaches that God organized intelligences before the world began. Abraham says that the gods organized and formed the world using pre-existing eternal material. They, that is the gods, organized and formed the heavens and the earth. It also teaches that God sent man to earth to test whether or not he would obey his commandments. And if he does, God would grant him glory. And we will prove them herewith, to see if they will do all things whatsoever the Lord their God shall command them. They who keep their second estate shall have glory added upon their heads forever and ever. It also includes what 9th president of the church, David McKay, says was the only scriptural basis from withholding the priesthood from those with black skin. McKay wrote, "I know of no scriptural basis for denying the priesthood to Negroes other than one verse in the Book of Abraham, 126. The Book of Abraham also includes 3 facsimiles, 3 images that are found on the original papyri. In the Pearl of Great Price, Smith actually walks through the images and provides an interpretation of what's going on. I have the Pearl of Great Price right here. You can actually see facsimile number 1 right there. Figure number 1 is seen to be the angel of the Lord. Figure 2, the guy laying there, is said to be Abraham fastened to an altar. And you can just look at this whole thing and kind of see some of the things that he identified. But the point is, when Joseph looked at these facsimiles, he identified the images with particular people and particular events. In fact, in Abraham 1:12, he actually references the representation of these events at the very beginning of the book. But the big question here is, what happened to the bits of papyrus that came into possession of the church in 1835. Well, after Joseph's death, the papyri actually stayed with his first wife, Emma Smith, and remained with her when the rest of the Latter-day Saints headed out west to Utah with Brigham Young. Now, it was presumed that these manuscripts were sent to Chicago and were destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. But as it would turn out, they weren't. In 1966, almost a century and a half later, a professor from the University of Utah was visiting the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. He accidentally discovered that some of the original papyri had ended up there. Over a year later, on November 27, 1967, Deseret News recorded this: a collection of papyrus manuscripts, long believed to have been destroyed in the Chicago Fire of 1871, was presented to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints here Monday by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Included in the papyri is a manuscript identified as the original document from which Joseph Smith had copied the drawing, which he called facsimile number 1, and published with the Book of Abraham. In the 1968 editions of the LDS Church's official Improvement Era periodical, they publicly acknowledged this find and provided the first clear images of the original papyrus manuscripts. Imagine the excitement that Latter-day Saints must have felt at this announcement. I mean, the original Book of Abraham manuscripts right here. And this would prove, certainly beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Joseph Smith was really a prophet. He was really a seer, and he really had the ability to translate ancient languages. Except this turned out to be a major disaster for Mormonism. Here's the problem. In that 1968 Improvement era, the LDS Church promised that Hugh Nibley, who was a professor at Brigham Young University, would provide the meaning of the hieroglyphics and illustrations. Expectations were set. A translation would be forthcoming. Nibley received help from LDS Egyptologist D.J. Nelson. And as Nelson worked on the translation of this, it became increasingly clear that these documents had absolutely nothing to do with Abraham or Joseph or even Enoch. They were just pretty standard Egyptian burial texts. After Nelson sent his findings both to Nibley and to LDS Church leadership, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints refused to publish the translation unless substantial revision or explanation of them was made beforehand. So instead, he published his translation through Gerald and Sandra Tanner of the Modern Microfilm Company, later renamed the Utah Lighthouse Ministry. Now, Nibley went on to publish tons of articles in the Improvement eras from 1968 through May of 1970, and he had tons of information in them. However, one thing notably lacking from all of these articles was an actual translation of the papyri. What's more, as I showed you earlier, Joseph gave a prophetic interpretation of the 3 facsimiles. But when these were compared with the numerous near identical images found in other Egyptian burial texts, They just had a totally different interpretation. Joseph took a common image that he didn't know was common, and he got the interpretation wrong. But it gets even worse than this. On the papyrus that contains facsimile number 1 that we have, you can see that parts of it are cut off. He didn't have the whole image, and so he kind of drew in the missing bits. But when we compare this with all the other versions of this from other burial texts, he drew it in incorrectly. What he drew in prophetically was not what the image should have looked like. How did the LDS Church respond to these findings? Well, at least directly, they didn't really respond to it. Not right away. While there were tons of unofficial works that dealt with some of the Book of Abraham problems, officially speaking, the church never released any statements that dealt with some of the problems that this raised. But with the dawn of the internet, a lot of the details about the Book of Abraham became far more widely known. And so the church did officially comment on this in their gospel topics essays, specifically with an essay titled The Translation and Historicity of the Book of Abraham. And if you're curious, you can go check it out right now on churchofjesuschrist.org. In that essay, the LDS Church does acknowledge that Joseph Smith never had any knowledge of Egyptian, but rather did this translation by the power of God. So for me, that only heightens the issue. Why don't the manuscripts align with the text of the Book of Abraham? Well, there are a couple theories for why this is the case put forward in this essay. The record of Abraham could have been edited or redacted by later writers. Moreover, documents initially composed for one context can be repackaged for another context or purpose. Illustrations once connected with Abraham could have either drifted or been dislodged from their original context and reinterpreted hundreds of years later in terms of burial practices in a later period of Egyptian history. The opposite could also be true. Illustrations with no clear connection to Abraham anciently could, by revelation, shed light on the life and teachings of this prophetic figure. The essay goes on to claim one other very popular theory as to why the two don't match. According to this view, Joseph's translation was not a literal rendering of the papyri as a conventional translation would be. Rather, the physical artifacts provided an occasion for meditation, reflection, and revelation. They catalyzed a process whereby God gave to Joseph Smith a revelation about the life of Abraham, even if that revelation did not directly correlate to the characters on the papyri. So to summarize some of the potential theories put forward here, perhaps what was going on is the Egyptians had used a pre-existing image and assigned meaning to it. Perhaps they had taken pre-existing characters and assigned new meaning to them. Perhaps the document that Joseph had been edited and changed, and what God was giving him is what the original said. Or perhaps the manuscript was itself just a means that God used to provide Joseph with the supernatural recounting of what Abraham had originally written. But the big problem with this theory is that that's just not what Smith said was actually going on. Josiah Quincy, who had interacted with Joseph Smith about these papyri, had claimed that Joseph stated, "That is the handwriting of Abraham, the father of the faithful," said the prophet. "This is the autograph of Moses, and these lines were written by his brother Aaron." Oliver Cowdery, speaking about the manuscript, said, "The language in which this record is written is very comprehensive." But for me, I think the kicker is actually at the very top of the Book of Abraham. It says this: "A translation of some ancient records that have fallen into our hands from the catacombs of Egypt. The writings of Abraham while he was in Egypt, called the Book of Abraham, written by his own hand upon papyrus." Written by his own hand upon papyrus. Joseph even took the first few lines of the papyrus manuscript and used those hieroglyphics to start making an Egyptian grammar and alphabet. He clearly thinks by this that the specific characters on the papyrus, when translated, will give you the Book of Abraham. I think that this quote by Sandra Tanner says it well. If the Book of Abraham is a product of revelation, not an actual translation, and the facsimiles were not drawn to illustrate Abraham's text, one wonders why the Mormons needed to invest so much money to acquire these pagan documents in the first place. In Joseph's day, the papyri were certainly presented to the public as actually being Abraham's record. I bring these things up because I think the LDS response to the Book of Abraham reveals a rot in the bones of the LDS Church, a kind of cancer that has been enveloping modern Mormonism. The idea that Joseph looked at a real manuscript and God gave him a spiritual translation is so problematic because it detaches Mormonism from a testable reality. It places Joseph's works in the sphere of the untestable. The Bible warns us about false prophets. Now, hear me out on this. They're real. It's not a matter of if they'll come, it's a matter of who they are. And the Bible gives us objective tests to know for certain who the false prophets are. Listen, when I interact with Latter-day Saints, they almost in every conversation I have refer to this subjective experience, to their testimony. The problem is the Bible doesn't just give us subjective experiences to bank on. The Bible also gives us objective tests. What happens with the Book of Abraham and the way Latter-day Saints treat the Book of Abraham is they say this is now untestable. It has, in essence, failed the objective test. But because of my subjective experience, my feeling that I receive when I pray, I can overlook the fact that an objective test has been failed. That is dangerous. And what it produces is a culture of people who no longer look at objective realities about things. And I think that this is becoming an epidemic within modern Mormonism. People don't really look at what their leaders are saying. People don't really look at what their leaders have said. They're not investigating the history of the LDS Church and the tradition of Mormonism. I know I'm making generalizations, but in my experience, this has been the case. Because there are problems like the Book of Abraham, subjective experience is everything. It trumps every other category. That's a huge problem. When the prophet in the Old Testament said, "Thus saith the Lord," if you rebelled against that, you were violating what God had commanded you. You were standing opposed to God's will. You didn't treat these prophets as a take what you want kind of thing. I mean, I always hear Latter-day Saints quote Amos 3 to me. God does nothing without revealing his secret to his servants, the prophets. So if we trust ourselves over the prophets, what's the point of having prophets at all? Latter-day Saints don't treat their prophets like they're really prophets. They think that they're prophets, that their own feelings and experiences are prophetic truth. And that will end with a church that has no common, consistent doctrinal core. It will end with no one actually taking the words of the prophets seriously. Here's what I want to say. Heed Jesus' warning. Heed the Bible's words. False prophets have gone out into the world. Know where they are by applying these objective tests. And keep in mind, if Joseph goes down, if when you apply that objective test, Joseph Smith falls to pieces, don't assume that the Bible is false too. Don't assume that Jesus didn't raise from the dead. You really can have Jesus without having Joseph. Christians have a rich tradition of thousands of years worth of thinking and doctrine and belief that is totally independent and separate from the LDS Church. If Joseph is false, then his claims about an apostasy are also false. So I would encourage you, use the objective tests the Bible gives you. Don't think that you need Joseph to also have Jesus.